Thank you, Boris, friends. I've been asked to speak on this issue of the Indian ruling class in search of an ideology. Let me start with some obvious propositions. India is a late capitalist industrializing society. Capitalist development is always uneven and combined. And what is the implication of this for India? Basically, it means that its ruling class is not as homogeneous, relatively speaking, as that of advanced countries. It has both a more diverse ruling class bloc as well as a much more diverse lower strata. One. Obviously, the Indian state has to protect the interests of this ruling class bloc. But the Indian state must also pretend to speak for the nation. In other words, in order for it to actually defend the interests of the ruling class, it must also have a legitimizing ideology which presents itself as speaking for the whole nation here. Or if you like, don't like the word pretend, state managers have to convince themselves that the state is really for the interests of everybody. And here, of course, comes the issue of nationalism and the ideology of nationalism, which is an extraordinarily powerful hegemonizing ideology, more powerful, incidentally, than religious ideologies, because it combines two characteristics. Like religious ideologies, incidentally, nationalism and religious ideologies are things that people are prepared to die for because it's a community of fate or destiny, is that the nation is not just a community of believers, it's a community of citizens. And that's a very important point. People forget that when Benedict Anderson talked about the nation, he didn't say imagined community for the nation. He said imagined political community, which makes it much stronger. Insofar as this is to be an ideology of the ruling class, that it means that the interests of the ruling class must be mediated through a certain nationalism, which has to be an Indian nationalism. What does that mean? It means it must have components which are distinctively Indian. So, what are those components? And incidentally, that ideology will also shift when the composition of the Indian ruling class bloc shifts. Because after 65 years of independence, the ruling class bloc in India today is not the same as the ruling class bloc that was there at independence and which carried on for some time. Okay, so what are the components of this distinctive Indian ideology? Let me suggest to you 4 components. One, the idea of India as this great enduring civilization. Very ancient, continuous. Okay? But India does not have a political unity over 3,000 years. In fact, only 4 parts of the world have had some kind of political unity over 3,000 years. Egypt, Persia, China, and I believe Yemen. Yemen also. Yes. Yes, Yemen. Yes. But that's it. India, in fact, has not had. And the India of today takes in parts which are never part of even cultural Hindu India. Nonetheless, that is a crucial component, this great civilization of antiquity. Second, this remarkable democracy, the world's largest democracy. Very important. Greatness, great democracy. Third, so many religions. What other country has so many religions? Multi-confessionality and yet secular. So, this is your third component. This uniqueness of India in terms of its antiquity and continuity, in terms of its secularity, in terms of its massivity, democracy, and fourth, unity in diversity. No country is as diverse geographically, from the Himalayas to the tropics, in terms of flora and fauna, in terms of languages. I'm not talking about dialects, I'm talking about languages, over 350 different languages. In terms of religious groupings, racially, physiognomically, I think only Brazil will have more diversity than India, because you don't have blondes and blue-eyed people in India, but you do have in Brazil. But otherwise, this remarkable diversity and yet unity. You are supposed to forget, of course, that this unity has been maintained by extraordinary brutality of the Indian state, whether we're talking about Kashmir or the Northeast. But you have these four components which are presented and which has got acceptance, unfortunately, from the right to very substantial sections of the left about this wonderful Indian ideology. Okay? What was the character of the ruling class bloc, and therefore, if you like, the kind of self-representation of the Indian state at the time of independence and afterwards? The ideology that was presented by the Indian state after independence, and which carried on till the 80s and then changed after that in the 90s, was the basic ideology of the Indian state: socialism, democracy, secularism, non-alignment. These were your four components. What was meant by socialism? Well, basically India, as a late developing capitalist country, had to have a state-led industrialization program. But because it had a mass national movement, there was also a certain component or a commitment on the part of the Indian state to pursuing social justice. So if you like, socialism meant, in practice, a state-led capitalist development, some commitment to trying to establish a welfare state, where India has actually failed substantially. But at least that commitment was there on the part of the Indian state. That's changed. Democracy and secularism I've already talked about. Secularism was very important because at the birth of India, there was a partition between India and Pakistan, where Pakistan was self-consciously created on the basis or argument that Muslims, by being Muslims, must constitute a separate nation. And India, in opposition to that, which is why it argues that Kashmir is part, was, unlike Pakistan, a secular country, and in fact has maybe the third or fourth largest Muslim population in the world even today. Right? So that's very much part of the self-image of the Indian state. And non-alignment, of course, both beneficial to it economically as well as politically. That, if you like, was the kind of dominant ideology of the Indian ruling class. The Indian private sector, the big bourgeoisie and so on, certainly benefited from state-led industrialization. And shortly after independence, you had a limited land reform which helped to create a wide class of rich farmers. And development since independence to now, the rich farmer category became particularly important and developed after the Green Revolution, where India achieved food self-sufficiency. By that, I do not mean that people in India could feed themselves, no, but it meant that India did not have to import food from outside. And you had the rise of a rich farmer category. This was important because the rich farmers influenced the state governments and had a political support which the industrial bourgeoisie did not have. Numbers count, and the rich farmer category could mobilize large numbers of people behind them, and therefore gave them great influence. However, by the 80s, a number of developments happened which changes the character of Indian society and the Indian ruling class bloc. One, you have the emergence of a very significant big business class. So a corporate India emerges, both succored by the Indian state as well as developing, a growing confidence on this part. Second, you have the emergence of what's called an Indian middle class. This Indian middle class is not a middle class like in advanced societies, because there the Indian middle class is a median category. That is to say, it's somewhere in the middle here, with 10-15% of the rich and very rich above, and 40% of the working poor, underclass, whatever you want to call it, below them. So it acts as a kind of social buffer. This is not the case with what is called the Indian middle class, which is your top 15-20%. And below it, 70%, 75% of other categories pushing them upwards. However, 20% of the Indian population is 250 million. And in due course of time, the total population of India will make it the most populated country in the world, more population than China, and its middle class will become bigger in number than the third most populated country in the world, which is the United States. Incidentally, the Indian middle class numbers are probably greater than that of the Chinese middle class. So, this category has also grown in self-confidence. It wants to enjoy the consumer lifestyle of the advanced countries and correctly sees its interests as being represented by the state and wants the Indian state to move in a direction which suits them. At the same time, because of pressures from below, this is also a frustrated and belligerent middle class, and this has expressed itself in a much more aggressive nationalism. This was obvious when India decided to go in for the bomb, the nuclear bomb. So you have a rising bourgeoisie, you have an Indian middle class. What happens to your rich farmer category? What happened to the rich farmer category is a certain division took place in which a substantial section now looks to exports and therefore is much more strongly committed to liberalization and globalization, while the other section, dependent much more on the Indian domestic market, has tended to lose out. Divided, the influence of the rich farmer category, which was strongest in the 80s, has since the 90s declined. Still important at the state government sector, but the Indian government, under pressure from the big business, from the Indian middle class, from this section of the farmers, has of course moved towards integration into the neoliberal world economy. And finally, a very important development has been the rise of what is called Hindutva, or the forces of Hindu nationalism. What is interesting about this Hindu nationalism is that it is also strongly committed towards liberalization, because its biggest gains in popularity have been in this Indian middle class. So, earlier its economic nationalism has now changed, and it is of course very strongly committed also towards liberalization. It is anti-Muslim. And what has all this meant for what I said earlier in terms of this continuing components of this distinctiveness of the Indian ideology? It means now that as far as secularism is concerned, there is a kind of reinterpretation of what secularism is supposed to mean. And that reinterpretation moves in the direction of saying that the reason why India is secular is because it is Hindu. Why? Because Hinduism is the most tolerant of all religions. Unlike Christianity, unlike Islam, it does not have one jealous God. It can accommodate many others. And it is the source. If you like, the argument is something like this. India is the most tolerant country in the world. Look at its diversity. Why is it so tolerant? Because it is Hindu. So, it is secular because it is tolerant. In other words, secularism arises out of an innate tolerance of India. In actual fact, there is a profound difference between ancient conceptions of tolerance and a modern conception of tolerance. An ancient conception of tolerance is simply coexistence, living together more or less peacefully. A modern conception of tolerance is a much stronger conception, which is connected to a modern conception of rights, especially minority rights. In other words, unlike what so many Indians say, secularism does not arise out of tolerance. It is in fact the other way around. A new conception, a modern conception of tolerance arises out of secularism. Nonetheless, the dominant, increasingly dominant view because of the rise of Hindutva is about this kind of tolerance. Second, democracy. The Indian ruling class has realized two things. Democracy is very important for India, even though unlike advanced countries, the poor vote in much greater numbers than the poor do in the United States or Europe or elsewhere. Democracy is very important because democracy keeps India united and provides this huge market and base of support economically for the Indian elite and the Indian big business. Second, democracy does not represent a serious threat to the ruling class bloc. Why is this so? Because one of the most important conditions for the durability of democracy in India is in fact that India is so incredibly divided by all kinds of lines of demarcation. Social, cultural, religious, racial, regional, you name it. In fact, no other country in the world has what's called the caste system. And what is the caste system? If not the most incredible way of dividing people, cutting across. And that is meant that in fact there is no real danger, or it is very, very difficult for movements of various kinds, and there have been so many movements in various kinds, to come together in a way which can seriously threaten the center. In fact, I would suggest to you that although of course you have had caste movements of assertion now, what has happened with these movements of caste from below is that they have helped to create a middle class and even a ruling class which is more socially diverse, which is more, if you like, socially diverse, and because it is more socially diverse, provides a safety valve and a stability to that. To put it slightly differently, the women's movement and the anti-racist black movement in the United States does not eliminate sexism and does not eliminate racism, but what it has done is that it has created a more ethnically and gender diverse middle class and ruling class bloc. Look at Obama being elected, which actually helps to stabilize the elite. The hopes that the caste movement from below would be a very powerful radical change has not really happened. And one simple way of understanding this is very simple. The lowest caste, what are called the untouchables. The majority of untouchables are landless laborers. But the majority of landless laborers are not untouchables. In other words, a caste-class connection has to be made, which has not been made. Caste is not disappearing. What's actually happening is that the reassertion of your caste has helped a number of people at the elite level to take their place. So democracy is actually not seriously, and my own suggestion, my own thinking is, ironically enough, the authoritarian regime of China probably has a greater potential for being shaken by the movements in China than that whole range of all kinds of movements you have in India, which, if you like, are diffused because their enemies and their focal points of opposition are so many, as in a democracy. And this is one of the great strengths of democracy. If you like, the whole of the Marxist tradition and the revolutionary Marxist tradition, which always assumed that bourgeois democracy would be a limited phenomenon, has actually been surprised. And if you like, the far left and the far right have both had a similar problem in terms of how to deal, in Europe for example, how to deal with this question of the endurance of limited bourgeois democratic structures. Anyway, so you have a new kind of ideology which includes the components of the past but has rejected two. The idea of socialism, which is written into the Indian constitution, is not taken seriously by anybody. The idea of socialist passé, it's a waste, it's gone. Secondly, non-alignment, over. There are some attempts to say that India should be non-aligned, etc. But really the dominant view today, related to India's sense of its past, is that we are this great civilization. We must get away from this idea of non-alignment. There is essentially a bandwagoning with the United States, and this is the way to move, because this is the way that India will take its place in the world. There is a certain sense of frustration that, look, everybody recognizes China as being so important, but what about India? And therefore India must take its place. We are tired of being hyphenated with Pakistan, as if Pakistan is our big problem. We, in fact, are a power that must now claim our importance in the World Community of Nations, and to do that along with the United States. Where is the general, I'll just briefly end here, where is the general direction, in my view, of where India is heading, unless things change rapidly? What is obvious and what gives a kind of minimal common foundation and vested interest to elites everywhere is that this era of the last 25-30 years of a certain kind of neoliberal capitalist development has created enormous inequalities of income and wealth and power of a kind that has never taken place before. And not only are there people who suffer from these inequalities, there are people everywhere who benefit enormously and have a common vested interest in maintaining it. Capitalism has intrinsic to itself the dynamic of competition. That's its driving force. It's a source of strength, but it's a source of weakness also. There must be a principle not just of competition, but of some kind of coordination, stabilization, which does not come from capitalism itself. So where can it come from? At the national level, it comes from the national state. At the global level, where should it come from? And here, interestingly enough, there is the debate within the Marxist tradition today about whether many capitals, which is central to capitalism, necessarily means many states, or in fact, is it conceivable? Sorry. Okay. That many capitals, which is central to capitalism, does it necessarily imply that there will be many states? Or is it possible to move towards forms of global governance which can even transcend the question of many states? And you have a division between Marxists, William Robinson, Sclair and others, who say that we are at least moving towards an incipient world state, and others who disagree. But I think we can all agree that for the next 15, 20 years, we are going to be faced with this twin dynamic of a capitalism, unless of course there are revolutions destroying it, and a multiple state system. And this multiple state system does have to take some responsibility even at the global level for trying to stabilize the situation. My own view here is that we are quite likely to move towards, apart from BRICS and G20 and all that, a more informal arrangement in which there will be an attempt towards establishing a kind of quintet. And that quintet is the United States, European Union, Russia, China, India. Why these countries and not Brazil or South Africa or Turkey or whatever? I think because these three countries have the minimum ingredients in sufficient measure. Demographic weight, economic strength in overall GDP, not per capita, military strength. And Japan could qualify, but it's too subordinate to the United States, whereas there's some here. Will this quintet succeed in stabilizing the global order? My answer is no. Very unlikely. Internal weaknesses and external weaknesses. The internal weakness, of course, is connected to how the United States relates to China and Russia in particular. There are no problems in the relationship between India and the United States, and not really between European Union and the US. So that is one serious area. The other aspect, of course, is that there is going to be increasing turmoil because the basic problems, ecological, economic, etc., are not going to be resolved over the next 20 years. And that means that this increasing turmoil will open up two possibilities. One, the possibility of progressive change for the better, but also the possibility of a further shift to the right, if you like, and the success of reactionary forces of all kinds. And this is very much an open question. I'll leave it there.
Спасибо. Может быть, есть пару коротких вопросов для уточнения? Коротких.
Нет, ну, я просто одно сначала очень короткое замечание по поводу индийского мультикультурализма хотел сделать. Предельный случай мультикультурализма в Индии имеется, насколько мне известно, более миллиона богов. I think you have more than 1 million gods in India. I was told. Это правда? Is it correct?
Yeah, that's in the sort of Hindu Brahmanical tradition. You're supposed to have over 1 million gods, and therefore, unlike Christianity and Islam, there is no single jealous God. And the claim, of course, is that because of this, there is an inclusiveness and tolerance at the level of ritual and beliefs, which is what creates tolerance in India. Now, this is very, very dangerous thinking, but it's a very popular argument. This India, which is supposed to be so wonderfully tolerant, has the most intolerant, extreme form of inequality and discrimination anywhere in the world, which is the caste system. You see, there is a very complex relationship between, if you like, well, let's call it ritual and belief tolerances and social tolerances. The singularity of a God in Christianity and Islam also means that there is a certain tension or pull, a push towards a certain egalitarian universalism. All that you can say is that different beliefs provide a certain input into the possibility of social and lived tolerances. But you can't say more than that. What actually emerges is always much, much more complex. So yes, at the level of rituals and beliefs, Hinduism is accommodating, but it accommodates you in a certain way which has its own level of intolerances by saying that, look, you have your truth and I have my truth, but my truth is better than yours because it includes your truth. And if you are saying that you are better than the other side, you're not really being even that tolerant. So it's a very complicated issue, but one must not make the mistake of drawing this simplistic, very popular culturalist notion that beliefs here of tolerance is that lead to this profound tolerance at that level. It is always a much, much more complex thing. And as I said, and I'll end here, is that we must understand that there is a profound difference between modern conceptions of tolerance and pre-modern conceptions of tolerance. And the modern conception of tolerance is connected to questions of rights, and it is not entirely a coincidence that it is not the Chinese classical tradition or the Hindu classical tradition, but the Greek tradition, which has provided somewhat more inputs into the development of a more modern discourse of rights of various kinds, etc. And that's related, in my view, to the peculiarity of the Greek city-state for all its oppression of women and slaves, in terms of being able to provide a material foundation which is very different in my understanding from that of China and India. But then I'm not an expert on the antiquity of China and India. So